The author, may Allah have mercy on him and relieve him and protect him and grant him the good that he asks for. He said, let it be furthermore known that being a master savant in the field of hadith does not in and of itself free a person from having to follow a master savant in the field of Islamic law or jurisprudence and fiqh. This is proven by the hadith, فَرُبَّ حَامِلِ فِقْهِ لَا فِقْهَ لَهُ, which means how many a carrier of hadiths that are evidence for fiqh, meaning practical rules, who has no fiqh. How many a carrier of fiqh who has no fiqh? That is, there are many. In other words, even a hafiz of hadith must follow the school of a mujtahid of fiqh in terms of religious rules. Yani, let's look at the hadith. How many a carrier of the hadiths that are evidence for fiqh, which is the practical rules, who has no fiqh? It means there are many who possess the hadiths that are evidence for the rules, but they don't possess the qualification to extract the rules from those hadiths. They carry the hadiths and they cannot extract the rules from those hadiths. So just because a person is a master in hadith science, a hafiz, doesn't mean that he's a faqih or a mujtahid in fiqh, in rules. So in other words, even a hafiz of hadith must follow the school of a mujtahid of fiqh in terms of religious rules. Not in terms of hadith, in terms of religious rules. Unless he is, besides being a hafiz, a mujtahid of fiqh, which has occurred. In another version of this hadith that was repeated twice already, the Prophet ﷺ said, فَرُبَّ مُبَلَّغٍ أَوْ عَامٍ سَامِعٍ فَرُبَّ مُبَلَّغٍ أَوْ عَامٍ سَامِعٍ, which means how many there are who have the hadith conveyed to them and understand it more than the one who heard it. How many there are conveyed to, meaning there are many who are conveyed to and understand more than the one who heard. How many there are who have the hadith conveyed to them and understand it, understand that hadith more than the one who heard the hadith. This proves that there are those who carry the hadiths to those who are more knowledgeable than themselves, who in turn take those hadiths and understand from them what the carrier of the hadith did not understand. The carrier of the hadith, meaning the memorizer of the hadith, the one who conveys that hadith, he didn't understand what the scholar of fiqh understands from the hadith. They would be able to extract religious rules from those hadiths while the deliverer of the hadith was unable to do so. He only understood what appears from the hadith. Meanwhile, the mujtahid of fiqh may be able to pull 10 or 20 benefits and rules from that hadith. The Wahhabis often discredit the followers of the four schools, which is the majority of the nation, by calling them blind followers. They claim that those Muslims follow the scholars instead of following the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. They have deemed themselves, those Wahhabis, the people of hadith, who suffice with the Quran and the Sunnah. For them, the details in the hadiths free them from needing the scholars. That's their understanding. Their understanding is, look, these hadiths are clear. We don't need to follow any mujtahid. They say, they were men and we are men. Shafi'i, Abu Hanifa, Malik, Ahmed, they are men and we are men. They have Quran and Sunnah, we have Quran and Sunnah. So why can't we do what they do? And the answer is simple. Qualification. You're not qualified. So if a scholar says something different from what they understand from a hadith in their limited knowledge, they reject him for their own opinion. This is the Wahhabi way. You can tell a Wahhabi all day, as Shafi'i said, Ahmed said, Malik said. If it doesn't comply with what they understand from a hadith, then they will reject it. The truth is that the Muslims follow the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam through the scholars. Saying that they follow the scholars instead of following the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is an underhanded way of saying that the scholars do not follow the Prophet. Because the Muslims follow the scholars who follow the Prophet. That is, the Muslims follow the Prophet through the scholars, because the scholars are the conveyors of the knowledge. So saying that the Muslims follow the scholars instead of following the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is an underhanded way of saying that the scholars do not follow the Prophet alayhi salatu wassalam. This is because if the scholars do follow the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, then those who follow the scholars also follow the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And if following the scholars is not following the Prophet, then what were the scholars following? If they were following other than the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, then they did not fear Allah. But they are the people that Allah said about them, إِنَّمَا يَخْشَى اللَّهَ مِنْ عِبَادِهِ الْعُلَمَاءِ. Those who fear Allah from among His slaves are the scholars. The Wahhabis either did not know or they knew but ignored the fact that the hadith scholars themselves were among the followers of the four schools. Imam Muslim and others among the greatest hadith masters followed the Shafi'i school. Muslim and At-Tirmidhi and An-Nasa'i, they're all Shafi'is. Even Al-Bukhari is counted among the practitioners of Shafi'i law, as documented in the famous book about Shafi'i scholars, Tabaqatu Shafi'iyah, by Ibn Subki. So, if the hadith masters were following schools, then what excused the ignorant laymen who, in the first place, have no true share in the science of hadith? What excuses anyone, hadith scholar or not, what excuses one from following another's school is to be a mujtahid in the law himself. If so, then he can rely directly on the Quran and the hadiths without imitating another scholar, as long as he does not break the consensus of the scholars before him. He is therefore bound to comply with whatever they have altogether agreed upon. Unless one reaches that level, which for most people is unachievable because of the high qualifications, one must follow those who reached it, even if he's a mujtahid in the field of hadith, meaning the hafiz. The job of the hafiz is to grade the hadiths, not to deduce rulings from them. The job of the mujtahid is to deduce rulings. The job of the layman is to follow the hafiz and mujtahids, as proven by the saying of Allah, فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلَ الذِّكْرِ إِن كُنْتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. Ask the people of knowledge if you do not know. Toyib, is it clear so far? Is there any question yet? And with minimal contemplation, one can realize the mistake of the Wahhabi in this issue. Because to follow the hadiths, one still must follow the scholars, the hadith scholars. What then made him, that Wahhabi, follow one group of qualified scholars and not another? Other than his devious desire? Why would he say, I'll follow the hadith scholars but not the scholars of fiqh? This is besides the fact that he follows Ibn Taymiyyah and is suspicious of anyone who does not. So, That's easy way to stick a Wahhabi who calls you or the Muslims a blind follower. You say to him, so what? So you saying you don't follow the Hadiths? So he might say, the Hadiths don't say that you can be a blind follower. So you have to get to know how the Wahhabi thinks. He doesn't really follow your reasoning a lot of times. So let's back up. A Wahhabi accuses you of being a blind follower, or the Muslims. So you can respond calmly, inshallah, and matter-of-factly, so you don't follow the Hadiths. So he might say, there are no Hadiths that say that you can blind follow. But that's not our point. Our point is, he called us blind followers for following the Imams of fiqh, the four Imams, Abu Hanifa, Malik, Ash-Shafi'i, and Ahmed. So just bring him back. Say to him, just answer my question, though. I didn't say that. I didn't say that the Hadith says that you can be a blind follower. What I'm doing is asking you a question. You don't follow the Hadiths? You don't believe in the Hadiths? He'll say, yes, I do. Because the Wahhabis don't reject the Hadith. He will say, yes, I do follow the Hadiths. So you say to him, and where'd you get these Hadiths from? They fell out of the sky? They grew on a tree? How did you get these Hadiths? He might understand your point. If he follows you and he knows what you're trying to get at, he'll cut the conversation right there before you can be explicit. He'll say, khalas, I don't want to talk to you anymore. And he'll stop you right there before you even get a chance to establish your argument. Or if he doesn't realize what you're about to do, he'll say, I take my Hadiths from the scholars of Hadith. Not realizing that he's contradicting himself right there. You can simply say, why are you then not a blind follower? Why are you then not a blind follower? How come I'm a blind follower for following scholars, but you're not a blind follower and you also follow scholars? He might say, but I don't follow the scholars, I follow the Hadiths. So you ask him, where'd you get those Hadiths from? The mailman delivered them to you or what? And like that, you will smash him easily in this issue. If he says the difference between my following the Hadiths and your following the scholars is that, he will say, blind following is following a scholar without knowing his proof. If that's what he says, then he has asked what the Hadith scholar's proof is. If he says to me, for Wahhabi said to me, blind following is to follow the scholar without knowing his evidence, I would say to him, and what's the Hadith scholar's evidence? If he says the chains of narration, the asanid, that's the plural of isnad, asanid. So if he says the chains are my evidence, then he is challenged to recite even a single chain by heart. If he cannot, then he follows the Hadith scholar without knowing his proof, and therefore he is a blind follower in his own standard. Is that clear? If by slim chance he can recite a chain by memory, then he is asked to explain why the chain is proof by clarifying the status for every narrator. If he cannot, then he's still a blind follower because he doesn't know the evidence. He's accepting it without evidence. If by even slimmer chance he can, break down each person in the chain, then he's asked two questions. The first is, how do you know the status of those narrators except by following the scholars? So even if he can break down and say, this is Fulan, son of Fulan, al-Fulani, And he learned from so and so, and he traveled to such and such place, and he has authored this and that book, and the scholar said he's reliable. And this second one, this is Fulan ibn Fulan al-Fulani, etc., etc. If he could by even slimmer chance break down that chain, then we still can ask him two questions. The first is, how do you know the status of those narrators except by following the scholars? Where did he get that from? Therefore, he is still trapped in the corner of a blind follower. Because the only thing he could have done to know these biographies was to go to the books of the scholars and study those books to know what the scholars said about the narrators. The second question is, what of the one who cannot explain the chains? What if there's someone who's not like you and he cannot explain these chains? Is he a blind follower who should abandon the hadith scholars like you abandon the fiqh scholars? Since you said blind following is to follow a scholar without his proof, without knowing his proof. Yani, this is so easy, brothers and sisters. You just might meet a Wahhabi who can maybe recite a chain of narration and explain it, maybe. So he'd probably think highly of himself, because Wahhabis are usually pretty arrogant even when they're ignorant. So how about a Wahhabi who has knowledge? Wal-'iyadhu billah. So we'll ask him, let's say he can explain the chain. We'll ask him, so what about someone unlike yourself who cannot explain the chain? Is he a blind follower who should abandon the hadith scholars like you abandon the fiqh scholars? Because you claim that's blind following, and consequently abandon the hadith? Should he abandon the hadith scholars and consequently abandon the hadiths altogether, like you abandon the schools? Here he will be silenced, because his conviction is that we must follow the hadiths and accept them from the scholars. They say about the scholars of fiqh, they are men and we are men. By that, they equate themselves with people that Allah elevated over them. When they say they are men and we are men, then they have equated themselves with someone that Allah made superior to them. Allah said, هَلْ يَسْتَوِي الَّذِينَ يَعْلَمُونَ وَالَّذِينَ لَا يَعْلَمُونَ? Which means, are those who know equal to those who do not know? For sure they are not. So to Allah, those scholars are better than those Wahhabis. Yet those Wahhabis equate themselves to those scholars. As stated, among the hadith scholars were those who were also fiqh masters who had their own schools. Among them was Imam Malik, the compiler of Al-Muwatta. Among them was Imam Ahmed, the author of Al-Musnad. Even Ash-Shafi'i and Abu Hanifa were among them, although some are ignorant of Abu Hanifa's mastery of the science of hadith. I have Musnad Abi Hanifa here in my house. Hadith book of Abu Hanifa. It was even said of Al-Bukhari that he attained the level of a mujtahid after being a follower of Ash-Shafi'i, and that his book of Sahih is not merely a book of hadith, but actually a clarification of his school. The scholars, they said that what Al-Bukhari really did is that he became a mujtahid, so he no longer had to follow someone else's school. Before he was a mujtahid, he was a Shafi'i, and then he elevated beyond that and became an absolute mujtahid. And he wrote his book of Sahih al-Bukhari, and that this book is not merely an exposition of hadiths, of authentic hadiths, it's actually his madhab. It's the clarification of the madhab of al-Bukhari, the Bukhari madhab. But they said this takes a person to study al-Bukhari to understand that, not just read it. Any question?